You're cracking with your teeth.
Yeah.
Hey, show me another one.
Yeah, give me the apple. Give me the apple.
Cracking with your teeth. Hey, there you go. I think it was a nut, not my tooth.
It's bush tucker, native Australian food, a natural resource known to few other than Aboriginal people and the Australian Army's bush tucker man. Much of our north is like this. It's the main reason why the population here is so sparse. This mostly is the domain of Aboriginal people. They've been living off the natural resources of this land for more than 40,000 years and are the only race that has been able to do so. Unaided, few other Australians could survive here for long. There are isolated pockets of civilization, but they're hundreds and sometimes thousands of kilometres apart. Yet this vast wilderness between Cape York and the Kimberley is the border between us and the rest of the world. Some say it's our most vulnerable frontier. We might have to fight here one day, and then many of us might have to survive here too. Such a prospect has led the Australian Army to undertake the first study in 200 years of the survival resources of Northern Australia. The project was proposed by Major Les Hiddens of Field Force Command, a bush survival expert with a lifelong interest in Australian natural history. A soldier aware of the military value of Aboriginal food-gathering skills. To prepare him for the task, Les in 1980 was granted a Defence Fellowship to study at James Cook University in Townsville. There he did research into the ethnobotany of Northern Australia, and since has become the Army's bush tucker expert.
My job is to look at the survival resources, the bush foods, the bush medicines, the bush techniques, so we can advise soldiers, particularly those who are born and bred in cities, on how to exist should they become lost, or in the case of, patrols like the SAS or the North Force Group, how to exist out in the bush by supplementing their rations off the local foods. To do this, we kicked it off from scratch, and I was given the task to go around and liaise with Aboriginal communities right throughout Northern Australia. And I guess today I've liaised probably with about 40 or 50 different communities, and they extend right through Cape York Peninsula, right up the top end of Arnhem Land, Kimberleys, and this year I'm also doing the central part. When I say liaise with communities, what I mean is I go in, seek out the older people generally, sometimes the younger people as well, and ask them to show me, a white fella, all about their particular backyard, about their bush foods, and about the knowledge that they have for that environmental area. They're very happy to do that, and I'm most grateful for their help too, I might add. Moving around these communities, I pick up different resources, different foods, and gradually, over a long, extended period of time, put it all together, and we build up a bit of a word picture and a bit of an idea of what is available out in the bush. I should also go on to mention that prior to this project commencing a few years ago, we had no knowledge. And that's generally true of our whole society, our whole country, because this sort of information is something that we really haven't bothered with, even though we've now been in here, in this landscape, for nearly 200 years. And now, someone is coming to grips with it. In this particular case, it's the Australian Army. It's also, of course, a contribution to the national estate, because it is part of our nation and it is part of our heritage, and we should know this sort of information. We don't have to go and use it, but we should have some idea of what our own countryside, what our own landscape is all about.
Major Hiddens estimates that there are more than 800 natural survival resources in Northern Australia. Already he has identified and catalogued over 400 bush resources that could be used for food or medicinal purposes. Few Australians would recognise, let alone use such products for food or medicine. This is not only because they're alien to our culture. Psychologically, most of us have been conditioned to accept food mainly in its modern forms. And that outlook is apparent everywhere, even in this remote Aboriginal community settlement of Kalumburu, in the far northwest of the Kimberley.
What's happened in our society today is this. All of our food groups, or most of them, have become processed and packaged. And the end result of that is that people have a great deal of difficulty identifying the original food resource. Now, in this case, this is a packet of tomato soup. We all know that, we all enjoy it and use it quite often. But if I were to take that back to my great-grandmother and say, hey, listen, how about knocking up some soup for us tonight from this packet? She'd wonder what I was on about. Because to her, soup was made by the tomatoes that grew out the backyard. She'd go and pick them, mash them up, and serve them up. I guess that 50% of people who use this type of soup and this type of food wouldn't know a tomato bush if they fell over it. The same can be said for something like this. This is corned beef, but the relationship between this tin and the original bullock out in the paddock is very far indeed. Today, the whole processing and packaging of food has been taken that one step further, because in the last 10 to 15 years, we've got that new invention, deep freeze. Come and I'll show you what it does to it. My poor old grandmother would turn in the grave if she could see this lot. Hang on, we'll get a couple out. Well, if I presented that to her and said that that's a chook, she'd really wonder. It's got a plastic skin and it's rock hard. This lot here, fish fingers. Wonder what she'd say if she could see these. We'll open them up and have a look inside. I guess if I asked her what that was, she'd say it was a biscuit. But in fact, and we all know it, it's fish. The processing of food has just gone so far that it's really extremely difficult to identify that original base product. Fish in a pack. From our point of view in the Army, the problem of getting soldiers out in the field to identify bush foods was pretty complicated. After all, in Northern Australia, I think we've got about 600 species. How do we train a soldier, who probably grew up in Redfern or somewhere like that, to come up here to Northern Australia, walk around the paddock and identify the bush tucker? Additionally, the seasonal variation of what was available was a greater problem. We could, I suppose, print a book or books showing pictures of the bush tucker, but the soldier would end up walking around the place looking like a library. What we came up with was this. It's one of our Army survey maps. And on one side it shows just the ordinary topo survey information. But you turn it over, and there on the reverse side is all the bush food for that particular map area. These things were out about a week, and the soldiers christened them snack maps. Of course, we're now putting them out with chocolate flavour and all the rest of it, so that if all else fails, you can eat the map.
There are difficulties, but the snack maps go a long way towards solving the problems. Each map covers an area of approximately 150 square kilometres, and on its reverse side is depicted the most important survival resources of that region. Alongside each picture is information on where the resource is to be found, in what season, how it should be prepared, what it tastes like, and what its nutritional or medicinal value is. The research program will allow the publication of over 700 snack maps, but before that can be accomplished, Les Hiddens has much more field work to undertake. He has completed Cape York Peninsula and most of Arnhem Land, but the Gulf Country and the Pilbara remain to be done. This year, he is concentrating on completing research in the central and northwest deserts and here in the Kimberley, where he is being helped by people from Kalumburu.
Ya gue berat begini. Kamu aja berada di sini. Come on, Eddie. Go.
Billabongs have always been an important source of food for these people, yielding aquatic foods such as fish, turtles, yabbies and mussels. But it's the plant life rather than the water creatures that they wish to show Les.
This one here. Same as that one out there?
That one, yeah.
Ah, but different one to this one here.
No, this different one, this one.
What, the root or what?
Yeah, that is finished now. That is dug now.
But the one there
Yeah,
comes off this one here.
he comes up this one now.
What, under roots in the mud?
Yeah, now it's the mud.
Righto. All right. How do you eat him?
Aye. Well, when you cook him,
You just cook him on the hot coal?
yeah.
Yeah, this is ashes.
I did
Sometimes you
Yeah.
boil it too, it's again.
Righto. You boil him too, or cook him on the ashes?
And ashes.
I did, yeah.
Yeah. And what's it taste like? Good duck?
Good, yeah. Good one.
Good dog.
All these lilies around here,
Yeah.
Good one.
they all got this on them.
All got that one.
Yeah, some small, some more
And
bigger.
some big one.
More bigger, more round, yeah.
More
That's
big
a-
one, you know.
So that's a little one, eh?
That's the little one, yeah.
at the hot coals.
The water lily is an important food resource as it has an energy value equivalent to beef steak. But more than its tubers are edible. Its flower petals and the white stalks of its leaves are nourishing vegetables too.
What about that leaf? You can eat that leaf too?
No,
Not at all.
not that. Only that what they got pretty good, you know.
Right.
That, you know.
And get him all year, dry time, wet time, all times.
Yeah.
All year.
But he could be growing by now.
Yeah.
But they got him that pretty good.
Yeah. All right. What do you want the tummy milk for?
You might find them. You go back and cut him up, put that on the milk, you know.
All right. If you can't find him, I've got the axe there anyway.
Yeah,
Put him
well,
in.
never mind.
Big axe. Harmy one. Okay.
Who's that?
Yeah.
What?
Put this one here.
Yeah.
That's the bee there.
Yeah.
For a sugar bag. How do you get him out? You chop him out. Ah.
Tasting is part of Les's job, as taste is important in the description of the food resource. Snack maps provide such information, and where possible, equate it with a European food.
This is probably the most favoured food of the Aboriginal people. These days they call it sugar bag. And it was
Wana.
popular, wala, locally.
Wana.
Sorry, wanna.
Wana.
Wanna. Wanna. There you go.
Wana.
Wanna. Anyway, as I was saying, it's probably the most popular food throughout Northern Australia and even Southern Australia. It was used and sought after extensively. It's made by the native bee, the trigona, these little fly-looking things you can see flying around behind me here. Fortunately for us, they've got no sting, so we can dig into their hive or cut down their trees, etc., to extract the honey. Now, you might think honey is honey, but in fact it's not. Because when we analyse this bush food honey, the sugar bag, or this wanya, we find that the energy value is about 20% greater than the honey you buy out of the shop. It's most unusual to find sugar bag in an ant nest like this. Most often it's found in trees. We don't really care where it's found at the moment because it tastes absolutely delightful.
Nutritional analysis of foods is undertaken by the Defence Food Science Laboratory at Scottsdale in northern Tasmania. It receives from Les frozen capsule samples of each food he collects.
Yeah. Hey, that's a big one, eh?
Big one.
Another one too?
Yams, the underground tubers of an infinite variety of vines, were a staple food for Aboriginal people in traditional times. They're rather like potatoes, and many species grow throughout northern Australia. Some require special preparation. This is a yam species Les has not seen. Some require special preparation. This is a yam species Les has not seen before.
That's it, that's it. Oh, good.
The numerous mangroves of our northern coast are a good and easy source of food, especially at low tide. Then, with a little knowledge, large quantities of edible crabs and shellfish can be gathered. Easy prey, like this mangrove snail, a species common in the north.
Eat this one too?
Yeah, eat it.
Any good for fish bait?
Yeah, fish bait, eating, people eating. Yeah.
How come he sticks on the root?
Well, when the tide come up, when the tide comes, and the mangroves. Yeah.
But he keep out of the water?
Yeah, you frightened of get drowned.
You frightened he get drowned?
Yeah.
Some sort of shellfish he turned out to be.
When you eat this, they keep you happy.
When you eat these, they keep you happy.
Yeah, good target.
Yeah.
The mud whelk is easy prey too, and often litters the floor of mangrove swamps.
But you just cook it up in the fire.
Yeah, just like that. And when you cook, them cook it in the fire, them boil them in the boil.
Yeah, boil it in the billy too.
Yeah.
We might get some and try it out, eh?
Oh yeah, if you like to.
Yeah, I reckon. Hey, tippy mother?
Yeah. That one.
Oh, all green.
Yeah, good target.
Oh, good too.
Yeah. See that one?
Yeah,
That one.
the big one.
Yeah, big one. Yeah, that one.
No.
Yeah.
It's the same one?
Yeah, hold up, yeah. Check out the green one? Yeah.
Yeah.
Check it. Yeah.
Did you do that?
Yeah, check this green part here. This green one here. Check it away.
Chuck it away?
Eat that one.
Righto.
Yeah. Grab that one.
Pull him out for that.
Just pull it up, yeah. That's it. Yeah, that one.
This right there.
Yeah, good target. Take the plate off. The plate?
Yeah.
That one. That's it, yeah.
Eat all that one?
Yeah, good target.
I reckon you could sell these in a restaurant down in Sydney.
Yeah.
You know, in this part of Australia, there's more to the coastal environment than the simple marine animals that live out there in the water. The whole coastline, the foreshore, has a whole variety of survival resources of its own. And I guess anyone that landed on a coastline like this, the first thing they would encounter are these little fellows here. And they themselves have two resource factors to offer any person surviving. Firstly, they can be eaten. Secondly, they're a bush medicine. Come and I'll show you how. What you do is you get inside the green ant nest. This is one here, and you can see them going quite angry about it. And somewhere in here, if we're lucky, and they're biting me at the moment, so I'll try and make this pretty snappy, we might be able to find some larvae. White larvae. There are millions of them. They're going a little bit ape. Actually, yes, there's some larvae there. And that larva, that white larva, if you can pick it out amongst the ants, I've got it between my fingers there, is edible. So are the ants, by the way. They think I'm edible at the moment. But that white larva was used by Aboriginal people as a cure for coughs and colds. And they grind it up between their fingers like that. A few ants thrown in for good measure. And then just eat it. Like that. Now they've got a very distinct flavour and tang to them. It's rather like lemony lime type of drink. And if they mix it up with water, they'd quite often make themselves what they call a lemonade drink. Well, today they call it a lemonade drink. And it was used quite extensively. I'll get ink stuck in the throat. Quite extensively throughout the whole of Northern Australia, not the nose, throughout the whole of Northern Australia as a cure for coughs and colds. And they're not too bad when they're not biting you. Anyway, over here there's something else too. This is the boab tree, and it grows only in the northwest corner of Australia, principally around the Kimberleys. Aboriginal people use the fruit, the nuts that is, which come on once a year. And that fruit and nut was pounded up to make a powdered milk-like drink, or it was eaten raw. When the fruit and nuts weren't available, they'd dig out the roots, and out of the roots they'd get the inner bark which surrounded that root casing, strip it bare, and twine it up to make a fish string, I guess you'd call it. And with that string, they'd then go back to the ocean and catch their fish. The nuts, we've got some old ones here. These nuts are the residue from last season, last year, and that's why they're so small and shriveled. Normally they're about 3 times that size. And when you break them open, you've got this white pith inside. That pith tastes like powdered milk, and that's the pith that the Aboriginal people used to eat. There's something rather interesting about the nutrition of these nuts too. A few years ago we picked half a dozen off a tree. We sent 2 of them in 1980 for analysis. They came back with a fairly high reading in ascorbic acid, protein, thiamine and all the rest. 2 years later we sent another 2 in, and we found that the deprivation loss in nutrition over a 2-year period was less than 40%. What that means is that those nuts in that condition are like a time capsule, a food time capsule.
Many botanists believe that the boab tree is not an Australian plant and was introduced centuries ago, but how is not known. Les has an interesting theory which could explain its presence.
I'll give you a bit of a thought process. You're going to have to pay attention because it's fairly complicated, and if you don't, you're going to get confused. This tree here, the Adansonia gregorii as it's called, occurs in 3 areas in the world. Here in the Kimberley, Africa and Madagascar. Nowhere else. The botanical opinion is that the 3 locations all have the same tree, Adansonia gregorii, even though they've got slightly different Sunday dressed up names. The botanical opinion is also that this one in the Kimberley was introduced by man. No one knows how or why, but that's the general consensus over in Kew in England. Put that to one side for a minute. Also in the Kimberley here, the same distribution pattern that this tree has, we have a very special type of rock art. It's called the Bradshaw art, or the Bradshaw paintings. The local Aboriginal people claim that they didn't do them, but it's not their work. You look at the local Aboriginal work, the rock art that they do, and you can see quite a comparative difference between the art of the Wandjina, the local art, and the Bradshaw art. Put that to one side for a bit. The third bit of information is that we know that there was once a trading route from Madagascar right up through the Indonesian archipelago, ending up in China. The thought occurs to me, and I just put it up as a thought, that perhaps that trading route, when the ships called into Madagascar, took on supplies of this nut. We know that it's a time capsule, and it would be ideal for a sea voyage of that type. Probably they put on a bit of indentured labour at the same time. And if those boats out in this ocean were to get shipwrecked in the same way as many European ships got wrecked along the Kimberley coast and the West Australian coast, we could end up with the distribution of both the rock art from the indentured labour on board and the tree from the food stored down below decks. One more thing, and this is a real classic. 5 or 6 years ago, an old Aboriginal fellow over in Derby told me the Aboriginal legend for this particular tree and how it came to be the way it is. He reckoned that once upon a time, way back in the dream time, this tree was extremely conceited. It had the best foliage and the most beautiful flowers of all the trees in the area. In fact, it was so conceited that the Dreamtime spirits got to it. They reefed it out of the ground, turned it upside down and plonked it back in. The branches you see now were originally the roots. Now, the fascinating bit about that legend is that the same story was told in Madagascar to explain the appearances of the boab.
Les spends between 7 and 8 months in the field each year. He loves the bush, but his lifestyle is not easy.
My field operation is what you'd probably call basic, and it doesn't have caravans and motels attached to it, and it's basically a swag on the ground, and sometimes I put up a bit of a tarpaulin in the trees, keep the rain off, or the sun. And I wash out of a bucket, I cook on an open fire. It's got to be basic because it's a one-man show. It's a set procedure to set up a camp. Straight into firewood, straight into water if it's available. And the swag out, then maybe put a cup of tea on and get the food ready. Sit out and write up the day's activities and beef up the catalogue, the bush food catalogue, write up the details that you recorded and seen during the day. And sometimes wish I had somebody else to make a campsite for me. I think, you know, sometimes I realise the isolation that I find myself in. You know, sometimes you can be there at night by yourself, camp somewhere, and you know that you're 200 or 300 kilometres from any living person, and you know you feel vulnerable should something happen. And sometimes things do happen, vehicle breakdowns and bogs and traumas like that. But because you're by yourself, you know that there's no way out of it except the way that you can provide. You've got to work at it yourself. Dangers vary, of course. They can vary from, you know, because I do a lot of night driving, because particularly during summer months, night driving is the coolest time to drive. And of course, night driving involves dodging cattle a lot of the place. Up in the top end, it's probably more of a problem when you're camping out because of the crocodile menace. A lot of waterways these days have a crocodile menace. Around Cape York, pigs are a bit of a problem. And also, of course, buffalo. I guess if I had a very great threat against me, such as a pretty angry pig or an angry buffalo or a crocodile for that matter, and I was capable of it, I'd use the revolver pretty well straight away. I guess people wonder, if you're out in the bush like this, just what sort of things you do miss. Personally, I reckon if you've got a great list of things that you miss, you probably shouldn't be out here in the first place. I can think of the things that I'd miss if I was in the city more than the things I miss when I'm out in the bush.
Travel is very much part of field research for Les Hiddens, and most years he drives more than 50,000 kilometres. Les is based at the Army's Field Force Battle School headquarters at Laverack Barracks in Townsville, and frequently traverses the continent by road in the course of his studies. Road travel provides the best means of transport for a research project of this nature, as it enables Les constantly to be aware of his surroundings and their potential survival resources. Many of the areas that he visits have little more than four-wheel drive tracks, making his task a little more tedious and a little more dangerous. In some areas, like here on the Kimberley Plateau, there are no Aboriginal communities, and Les has to work alone. Research in such regions requires much more driving and footwork, but mainly as a matter of observation. Many of the survival resources of the Kimberley are common throughout the region and are often found in other parts of northern Australia. The main difference between the Kimberley coast and its high country lies in the creatures and plant life which rely on salt water and in the landforms. Here in the high country, they can be extremely beautiful.
I guess if there's a heart for the Kimberley, it's got to be around here somewhere. Because this land formation, which perhaps is the oldest formation of land in Australia, runs all the way through 200 kilometres right up to the coast. On one side we've got the Glenelg River, and on the other the Prince Regent Gorge. Even in the dry times, such as now, the streams and the rivers and the springs all flow and produce water. So Aboriginal people, when they lived here traditionally, would have found it reasonably easy to subsist. I say reasonably, because subsistence is always difficult. Aboriginal people had a different perspective on the landscape to European people. The first European or white man to have his ventures in this area recorded was a fellow called Gray. And he put ashore right up on the coast and tried to walk down through this area. He looked around and saw nothing as far as fruit and vegetables was concerned, so he planted some of his own. The mind boggles as to exactly what it was he tried to grow in the Kimberleys, but I can imagine it with things like cherry trees and peaches and apples, which wouldn't have existed too well. But there was no need to do that, because this countryside had been supporting Aboriginal people for 40, 50,000 years. When I look around here and see some of the vegetation that is here and producing fruit, even at this time of year, Gray was wasting his efforts. I can see over here about 5 different examples of billygoat plum or salty plum. Let's go and have a look at them. Well, even if Gray had recognised these as being bush tucker, and that's pretty unlikely, he would have had no idea of their particular nutritional value. We only found out ourselves about 4 years ago. We put these through the laboratory, and we found to our amazement that this little fruit, which is one of the terminalias, is extremely high in ascorbic acid, vitamin C. In fact, it's so high it now leads the world. So you see, it didn't matter how many oranges or apples that Gray may have planted, we couldn't compete with this one. I guess the best way to equate the value of this, and it's only about as big as a thumbnail, is this way. One of these fruits is equal to eating 8 or 10 oranges from a vitamin C point of view. And if Gray had done that on his trip through here, he would have had no scurvy problems whatsoever.
A Darwin-based company is investigating farming the salty plum. The only other native Australian food plant that has been commercially successful is the Queensland or macadamia nut.
The common name for these terminalias is salty plum. And as I look around here, just this fine, small area, I can see about a dozen examples. It's a real little grove in itself. Of course, it would be different if I came back in 3 months, because then the fruit would have dropped and the trees would be bare. That's half my problem. I've got to keep coming back to areas to capture the seasonal change and the seasonal alteration. Aboriginals had to do the same thing, and that's why they move so often. There are some species, however, that last for extended periods throughout the year. And some of those species grow in this area. I guess probably one of the best examples of a species that does last a long time is the pandanus.
The pandanus, or screw pine as it's commonly known, was mistakenly identified by early European settlers of northern Australia as the breadfruit tree of the Pacific Islands, a plant which offers greater food resources than our pandanus.
I guess of all the plant species in northern Australia, the pandanus would be the most representative, because it grows right throughout the top end and it's very commonly found, particularly around creek lines. For Aboriginal people, though, it didn't represent a great resource. The food, the fruit that is, could be eaten, but generally was accepted as being a rubbish food, used in emergencies only. The parts that were eaten were in fact these segments, and this fruit here is dropping its segments and littering the whole floor around underneath the tree. What happens is this: the segments fall off. If you like, you can suck the ends, but that's a bit of a problem. Leichhardt found that out. He tried it and got burnt and blistered lips. Leichhardt tried all sorts of things, in fact. He got so desperate at one stage that he even ate his saddlebags. Anyway, if you were to cut this in half, what you find inside each one of these segments here, a long, elongated almond-type nut. I've cut one in half and I'll just show you what I'm talking about. Down here somewhere. You can see inside the segment half a dozen small almonds. They can be prized out with a pair of tweezer-like instruments. In fact, Aboriginals used a split twig and dug it in and pulled the almonds out. But it was a lot of work and a lot of energy was expended getting them. So the food was a rubbish food. Additional to the food source, though, we have the leaves, and these were split just like this. And the thin strands were then taken and used to make baskets. And they can be split into any number of segments like that, because they run along the lateral veins like that. And sometimes they were used for twining and tying up things. It had one third and final use, and that was the root system. The roots could be pounded up, mashed up, then boiled in a broth and sipped to relieve the symptoms of coughs, colds and flu. Not all foods were commonly accepted in this category across Northern Australia. In fact, it's rather interesting when you think about the Aboriginal people, the way the tribal groups are separated and yet all butting up against one another right around the top of Australia. People in one side, the eastern coast, will not have the same food values as people, say, in the western coast. I'll see if I can find, I think I saw, there's a planturia over here. We'll have a look at that, because that typifies exactly what I'm talking about.
The planturia species is common throughout coastal northern Australia and is a plant that offers a variety of survival resources.
This is the tree that I was talking about. Its Sunday dressed-up name is Planchonia corea, in other words, cocky apple. It's called cocky apple because the cockatoos in particular like eating the fruit. But it's rather interesting because I found when I was cataloguing, in this tree in particular, different uses by different Aboriginal groups across the top of Australia. I think it was first shown, this tree, about 1979, up Weeper or Arakoon way. And up there the people told me that you could eat the fruit. Well, that's perfectly correct, you can. Later on, a few years later, I went over to Milingimbi, over in the top end of Arnhem Land. And there I asked the people about this tree again. I didn't know anything about it being able to eat the fruit, but they did know that you could use the root system as a medicine. What you could utilise was the bare root system cut away from the wood, heated on a fire and applied to a sore tooth. The sap contains an analgesic, and that affects the nerve in the tooth, putting it to sleep, thereby stopping the toothache. So then I had two uses for this particular plant. Two different Aboriginal people had told me that, from two different areas. Finally, the third use cropped up in the Kimberley, and that was the fact that this thing here is a fish poison. You can crush up the bark, wash it in the water, and kill the fish in that pool of water. It doesn't contain any toxin or anything like that, but what it does do is cut down the oxygen content in the water, causing the fish's gill system to fail, and therefore they come float belly up on the water.
The red sap of the bloodwood eucalypt is a valuable medicine also.
This is the bloodwood, and you can see by the colour of it why it gets that common name. It's got this bright red colour, and it was used as an antiseptic by Aboriginal people. They'd mash this up, add some water to it, make a poultice of it, and put it on a wound. And within a few days, the wound would begin to heal. We've since analysed this and found that it does in fact contain antiseptic, and that's why it worked. But Aboriginal people always knew that.
Water is the essential element of all life forms, and where it occurs in quantity, Like here in the mighty Ord in the northwest Kimberley, it often provides an abundance of food resources from water and land. Many are easily gathered, like this native Australian fig.
This is the cluster fig, and you can tell why it's called the cluster fig because of all these clusters coming out of the trunk. I reckon it's probably the best fig we've got in Australia growing naturally. It tastes very, very similar to the domestic fig you buy in the shop, and inside you've got the normal fig structure, complete with the odd grub walking around fertilising the flower. The fig tree itself, this one here, always tends to grow in close association with water. It needs that water to survive. Consequently, if you ever see a fig tree like this with big clusters on the trunk, you know that somewhere very close by is a good, reliable water source. You might have to dig for it to get that water, but it's got to be there. Here, in this particular case, we've got a river source, a fairly large one, just over the way there. And while we're still here, we should go down and have a look at that to see what resources, survival resources, can be found around the banks of that river. These figs are quite excellent. Well, having a bit of a quick look around here, I can see about half a dozen resources that are worthwhile. There's one in particular which is quite spectacular, and that's the Tipper augustifolia, commonly called bulrush. It's growing on the other side of the bank over there, so I'm going to have to go over and do a bit of a swim for it, which I can't complain about on a day like this. The bulrush, of course, grows all over Australia, not just here in the north. And for that reason, I guess everyone will be able to recognise it in their own paddock, wherever you happen to live, almost, except in central Australia, of course. It tends to grow around the edges of waterways. It's got to have that water, otherwise it doesn't survive. And it proved quite a basic, useful product to Aboriginal people when they existed in areas like this. Anyway, I'm off for a swim.
The Ord is only one of the mighty river systems that drain the Kimberley and often provide obstacles for Les. Much wildlife is dependent upon such waterways, and in bygone times it was hunted and eaten by Aboriginal people.
This tipper grows like a big forest. And right now, down on my knees in mud. Back up again. Just like a big cane farm. Nearly lost my hat in that lot. Anyway, this is what it's all about. And you might be able to see little clouds of yellow pollen going through because we're here at exactly the right time of year. The new flower buds are producing pollen all over the place. You can see the old flower buds, these old fawn-coloured ones, and on top of that, we've got the pollen on the new buds. I'm a bit out of breath. Just have a look at this, because this, I think, is quite spectacular. We tap that, and there's all the pollen. And that stuff is edible. Aboriginal people used to get it, mix a bit of water to it, put it together, make a johnny cake out of it, and cook that on the hot coals, and then eat it. You can also eat it raw. And it's got a very blandy, flour-like taste, because I guess it resembles flour in the way it was processed. Anyway, there's lots of it around here. I'm going to get some samples. Have a look at this. Oh, it's all over the place.
There are many parts of northern Australia where water, the essential survival resource, is sparse. Vast areas like the central and northwest desert regions. There, Aboriginal people have lived also for more than 40,000 years, but with much more difficulty than their contemporaries in more fertile areas. Spinifex deserts make up most of this part of the country. The Tanami Desert, 700 kilometres south of Darwin in the Northern Territory, is typical.
That's hot. It's got good reason to be too, because this is the arid zone. I reckon you could just about fry an egg on that bonnet. Most of the year, the temperatures around this area are around about the 40-degree mark, if not higher. The temperature and the lack of rainfall has made the landscape like this. It's evolved with the spinifex clumps and, of course, the stunted anthills. That made it doubly difficult for the Aboriginal people to exist and subsist in this environment. They had to keep moving all the time, chasing the water, chasing the rainfall when it happened. There was one particular bloke I can think of, an anthropologist by the name of Tyndall, and he did a bit of figuring out and worked out that for this particular environment, the Aboriginal people required one person per 70 square miles to subsist. And that's a big, big slice of land when you think about it. One person for every 70 square miles, because it took that much landscape to support one individual. See, the problem is, as you move around the place, the lack of water, it's got a lot of competition. That little water that remains in the rocks and crevices and around the creek lines, the animals are after it, the birds are after it, and if you're trying to live here, you're after it too. And you come up to it, and you find that it's probably all drunk out, and you've got to dig it deeper. And if there's none there, no matter how much food there might be around you, you've got to move on. Chase that water all the time. I was talking about competition with animals. It's the same with the food too. You move across to a bush and it might have half a dozen berries on it. And if you can get it before the birds do, so much the better. But if you're a bit slow, a bit late, you miss out too. You've got to move on to the next bush. And it's a constantly moving program to subsist in this environment. In fact, I reckon this is probably the harshest environment to try and survive in.
50 years ago, this land provided all the resources of the Warlpiri people. But today, most of them live in the nearby Aboriginal community of Largermanu, where European foods and medicines have largely replaced traditional resources. The Warlpiri, like most other Australian Aboriginal groups, no longer have to hunt and gather, and their great skills of food gathering are being lost. Only a few of the Warlpiri are able to help Les with his study, and they are mainly the older people.
Cook him on the coal?
Yeah.
Yeah, make a johnny cake out of him. Well, it's one of the acacias. I'm not entirely sure which one it is. Second? Mix him up with water.
Water.
Yeah.
And the rock, like that.
Grind him on that rock.
Yeah.
Yeah, grind him up.
Yeah.
Right, as I was saying, he's one of the acacias. I'm not quite sure which one it is because I've not encountered it before. But because of the massive seed pods on it, obviously you grind up the seed pods and make a bit of a johnny cake out of it. Yeah. Then cook him on the hot coals, and then you can eat him.
Comparatively few of the desert plants are a source of food, and those that are often only produce their edible products after rainfall, which can be years apart. One common exception is an insect gall caused by chemical interaction between an insect and a species of eucalypt tree.
This is the result of an insect gall. It's all, I think its name is Cysticoccus, which makes you laugh. But inside, what you quite often get, if it hasn't flown the coop, is in fact a grub. There it is. And that grub's edible, raw. Fairly high degree of moisture in that grub. And it's got all this stuff here which you can eat as well. Additionally, you can eat the white lining of the wooden gall. They're found growing on eucalypt trees right throughout the arid zone and other areas too in Australia.
Knowledge and experience is essential in the eating of desert plant foods, as poisonous species do occur, even in the same plant group. The desert raisin is an example.
These are part of the Solanum group, and you've got to be very careful when you pick them because the Solanums belong to the deadly nightshade group. So if you know what you're doing, you're okay, but if you're just pottering around experimenting, I wouldn't advise it. But these fellas here are found right throughout the arid zones and the desert countries right throughout Central Australia, but different species of them in different areas. These people here obviously know which species in this particular area are edible. And one of the key signs, in fact, if you look very, very closely at the seeds, you'll find little fine grains of sand sticking to them, and that's one of the indicators.
Les's passengers often direct and set the mood for his field trips. Women from the larger Manu community especially enjoy them. The first stop is for the wild tomato, a desert fruit that's useful food, but only for the experienced.
Well, this is again one of the solanums. They're commonly called wild tomatoes in this part of the world. And as you can see by that reaction, Aboriginal people rather enjoy collecting them. In fact, they enjoy bush tucker trips, particularly like this, which makes my job a lot easier. Just back to the fruit, unless you get rid of these black seeds that you can see inside, they're deadly poisonous. But once you've got rid of them, you can eat them raw. They do have a fairly bitter taste though, and I'm not particularly fond of them myself.
For those with the knowledge, many desert plants harbour more palatable, safer and nutritionally valuable foods.
Still down there?
Yes.
There it is.
Yeah.
See?
Oh, yeah. Got him.
Put it down.
As that root broke off, he stayed in the
Yeah,
ground.
yeah.
What?
Hey, big one too. Listen, I'll just tell you what. Can you just hold him in your hand?
Yeah,
And I'll take a photo. Yeah, just like that. Just like that.
Put it down.
That's it, one. Put him up this way. I'll get another one too. Well, what you're seeing here is an excellent example of the division of labour in Aboriginal society. It was the men's job to do the hunting, and the women, they had to go out and gather. In this particular case, what they're after are these things here. This is the witchetty grub. And I guess everyone that knows anything about Aboriginal survival techniques will recognise this fellow, or at least would have heard of him. They're found here in the roots of these little scrubby acacia trees. And the women are digging them up with their digging sticks, breaking open the roots and extracting the grubs out. Nutritionally, they're excellent. I think from memory they've got about 40% protein and about 30% fat, and a bit of moisture as well. So you can't complain. You can eat them two ways. You can either fry them lightly on the hot coals, or secondly, you can eat them raw. Either way, they're quite delicious. In fact, they have a taste that's fairly rich. It's a bit like eating raw eggs and butter mixed up together. And I find that one or two is about enough. I've already had one, but I'll have another go at the second one.
Yeah, take one. Put it down.
Hey!
The animals of the desert are its greatest source of protein, and traditionally the smaller creatures mainly were hunted by women. Burrows are much more easily found in burnt-out regions. Aboriginal women have great respect for lizards, as often their capture can prove traumatic.
Well, this is the blue tongue, and it's one of the favoured foods in this part of the world, along with goanna. And what these ladies have been doing is walking around this burnt-out area, looking for the burrows. This is one of them here, and that's how they came across this fella. He'll go into the pot later on this afternoon. But it reminds me of a rather funny story, a rather funny incident I had a few years ago, probably over Port Keats Way, I think it was, where a group of ladies like this were out chasing goannas one day. And they found a hole, and they dug him up. And the old goanna came out of the hole, and he looked around, and the first thing he saw were two skinny black legs in front of him, and he thought they were trees. So he ran straight up the lady's leg, right on top of her head, and she was running around everywhere with the goanna on her head, you know. So you've got to be very careful with goannas. And blue tongues, of course, because they do scratch and they do climb up ladies' legs. The bush tucker you've seen on this particular program is only a very, very small fraction or representation of what we've got available here in Northern Australia. So far, we've catalogued about 200 or 300 species, maybe even 4. And I guess there's probably another 400 out there waiting to be catalogued. That'll take me another 2 years, I'd imagine. All of it, of course, is being done courtesy of Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal people. But for us in the military, it's got particular and special relevance, particularly here in the Australian continent. Because we've got units and organisations like SAS and North Force who, in a wartime setting, would rely on these sort of resources to some extent to support them in the battlefield. Well, I suppose with another 2 years' work ahead of me, I'd better get going and stop talking to you lot.